So going home and having to tell your wife and your children that actually you're out of a job was a big shock. I would get home at the end of the first few days and I was just exhausted every night.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed it. I think a good business, Gary, is somebody who can go through their customer list every year and look who they're going to stop trade away from.
Yeah.
Who doesn't fit the mould of the business anymore. I remember winning our first six-figure project. I remember the excitement, but also the dread and the scare of how on earth are we going to deliver this? How are we going to cash flow it? How are we going to resource it? A lot of this stuff that you need for business and even just for life skills, these kids don't get taught in school.
Yeah.
We're expecting these youngsters to come into the workplace and be fit for work, and they're not.
What's missing, do you think? Welcome to the Business Sense podcast. I'm Gary Crosby. This is the podcast where we make sense of the business journey by talking to owners about what they've learnt along the way. Let's jump into today's episode. Mark, thanks for joining me this morning on the Business Sense podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the story of how you went through from being a tradesman yourself all the way through to setting up and running a successful company. But let's just go right back to the start. I imagine at this point you're at school and you've got some choices in your life, and at some point you decide that you're going to be an electrician, be an apprentice. What happened there?
So I suppose a little bit of influence there comes from family background. My brother was a plumber at the time.
Yeah.
He's quite a bit older than me, and it was actually my sister who came up with the suggestion of being an electrician.
Right.
That was randomly when we were out walking the dog one night.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where it all stemmed from, really. As we then went through the various careers things at school, I wasn't particularly academic, and as you can imagine, they tend to push you down the trade route when you're not particularly academic.
Right.
Certainly back then at school. So we then progressed through applying for apprenticeships. I was quite fortunate. I got into quite a good apprenticeship. I was on RF Wittering for my first year of my apprenticeship. So I looked after the maintenance of the buildings with the electricians there, which was some really good experience and fantastic stuff to learn on there.
Yeah.
Some really good experiences. And then from there, I was made redundant after 18 months when the company I was working for lost the contract. And I went on to work for another company looking after the Cambridge County Council properties. And again, some really good experiences there, some really good learning opportunities, and working with some really good engineers who took the time to teach me. So I was very fortunate from that point of view, really.
And when you're in that environment, did you spot other people stepping out to start their own businesses? Was there a sort of trend there that you would be an apprentice for a while, do some work, and then maybe think about starting yourself?
Not so much when I was younger. When I became qualified, absolutely. So I remember being, as a young, I was still in my third year of my apprenticeship then, when the company I was working for actually took me off the tools to be an understudy to one of the contracts managers.
All right.
And you could then start to see a bit of a trend happening then. When I qualified, I remember working over on a site over in Kettering, and I specifically remember then seeing a big trend of self-employment happening within the industry.
And was it always successful, or did you see people going out, giving it a go, and then thinking, I want to come back and have the security of a paid job, if you like?
Thinking back to that time, I don't recall seeing that. There was a lot of, I think back then, because of the way the economy was, there was a real influence on people wanting to go out and be self-employed. So even after I was qualified, I went out and did a bit of contracting for a few years. Yeah. And that seemed to be very much the trend. I think setting up a business as such maybe wasn't quite so, I was going to say quite so easy, but maybe wasn't quite, people weren't maybe quite so keen to do it as maybe what they are now, I would say.
So I guess there must have been a moment then in your career at some point where you were looking around thinking, I think I can probably do this on my own. Talk me through that bit.
Yeah, so I think as a youngster, I've always really wanted to have my own business. Going back to being a young lad at school, wanting to do it and doing it are two very different things.
Yeah.
And I think I always felt as a young engineer, I never really had that skill set to be able to really pursue that as much as I wanted to do it. I think when I went through the period of contracting, I thought I was probably going to be able to develop that. But then I ended up taking a job for one of our customers at the time, which then spiraled me down sent me down the management career.
Yes.
Which is where I really learned my skills on how to manage jobs, not how to manage people, how to manage jobs.
Right.
I think the skills of managing people came a lot later on.
Right. And that skill to manage jobs, I guess, is, it's pivotal in the difference between being an electrician and being the owner of a business. Absolutely. And that idea that every job has to be profitable and you're keeping an eye on the cost and things, that must have been a good grounding for future business.
Fantastic. I was very fortunate that I had a manager who, as I started off in my management career, who stood by me. I was very young. I was only 23 when I went into the management game. So I was very young, very inexperienced, probably too young and probably too inexperienced, if the truth be told.
Right.
But I was very fortunate. I had a manager who believed in me and obviously saw something that he stood by me and pushed me and pushed me hard. And I had to work very hard to maintain that role. Was I particularly good at it to start with? No. But I learnt it and I grew into it. And developed a reasonably success of it by the end of it.
Yeah. And that's powerful, isn't it? At the beginning, when you've got a strong manager who's really a mentor, who's pushing you hard and making sure you learn what you need to learn.
Absolutely.
So there's a point then where you decide, right, I'm going to go and do this on my own, and EML is born. Talk me through the birth of EML. What happened there?
So EML came about. I'd changed jobs. So I changed jobs a couple of times, and one of the latter job before EML, I'd been there for a year, and after the year, it was decided that they weren't going to renew the contract after the first year. So I was quite shocked by this because that was, I was used to being quite a well-known person in the industry who the thought of somebody not wanting to employ me was a big shock to me. But actually, it was the best thing that happened because it knocked the arrogance out of me. So it changed me quite a bit as a person. So going home and having to tell your wife and your children that actually you're out of a job was a big shock.
Yeah.
But we had Christmas 2 months away. My wife was about to give birth to our fourth child. So we had to do something about it. There wasn't really a great deal of jobs going at the time because it's in the run up to Christmas. So
yeah,
the job market wasn't very buoyant at the time. So we went down the route of setting up EML. So it's something that I'd always wanted to do, but I never really planned for that to happen. It kind of just happened, and I've never really looked back. Really, it was probably the best thing that ever. It was the best thing that ever happened to me on a business level, but also on a personal level as well, because it changed me as a person and how I view things. Definitely.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I'm guessing EML. Esther and Mark. Where's the L?
So that's the EML is the first letter of all the names of the family. So you got Esther, Mark, Esther. You got Ellie, Lucy, Luke, and Libby.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and then we've got our fifth child, who's Freddie, but he came on along after EML was born. So he's we're not going to put an F in there.
There's no place for an F.
No, we're not going to change the name for that. But yeah, that's
so mindset wise. You've made that decision, kind of had the decision forced on you in a way to take that leap yourself. Talk me through those first, few months where you're now setting up the company. Mindset's really important. Getting everything set up correctly. What was it like in that first quarter?
Frightening in some ways. You are now completely dependent on getting that work through the door and being able to get it. The biggest thing for me was I had to go back out on the tools. Now, I'd been off the tools for a number of years.
Yeah.
And while you may never lose your ability to do your trade, you lose your speed at doing it, and you lose almost like your fitness. It's almost if you stop running for a while and then go to run again, it's a big shock to the system, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was very much the same as going back out on the tools. So I was going back out on the tools to start with, and that was hard. That was really hard. I would get home at the end of the first few days, and I was just exhausted every night.
Yeah,
but I really enjoyed it. But it was hard. I was started going off, and I was going to work for other electrical contractors to start with. It was in a matter of, I'm going to say 3 months or so, and I'd managed to get a couple of contractors working with me who were also then we're also then going off and working with for other people as well, as a team. Then the phone started ringing.
Right.
And the phone started ringing from people of contacts and reputations I'd built up over the years. And that's when it started to change. I remember getting my first call from a client who I'd worked with for a number of years. He'd actually worked for us for a number of years. So we'd got a call from a client who'd worked from us for a number of years in previous roles, who was now offering us work.
Yeah.
And that was a really good feeling. You thought, yes, we can do this. So we went off, we got our NIC registration. We started to then set ourselves up as a proper business rather than just being a contractor.
And at that point, you are a tradesman, you are an electrician, but you're also head of marketing and head of sales and head of finance and head of HR and head of everything in the company. What kind of pressure did you feel at that point?
I think when you're at that point, it's very different running a department for a company, very different to then running a business.
Yeah.
Hugely different.
Yeah.
And I think when I look back at the experience I'd gained over previous employments and the different roles I'd done, and then you start to bring that all together, bits start to fit into place. But it was very, very overwhelming to start with, because it's trying to work out, where do we want this business to go? Is this just going to be me and a couple of guys in a van? Is this going to become something that we want to build into what I would call a proper business, where we've got multiple people working for us and so on? So I remember sitting there and drafting up a bit of a business plan for it, and writing it down. Part of me would like to go and grab it at some point and have a look back through it, but I know some of the numbers we put down for the first 3 years of what targets we wanted to hit. I mean, we well exceeded those, but you look back through at some of those things that we've done, and the little, say for instance, some of the marketing ideas that we'd learned over the years that we'd started to implement and put in there, and started to join all the dots and put things into place. But I think the more I did that, I think the more I realised how much I didn't know.
And that's an important point, isn't it, for business owners? Because it makes them, they then think to themselves, who do I need to get in to fill the gaps in my own knowledge? Was there a particular moment where you decided, right, now is the time and I need to get people in and around me?
I think we were probably we're probably 12 months down the line, maybe a bit more. And I had somebody who came and approached me who's quite keen in his marketing, and he wanted to work with us and coach us through. And I think that was I'd always had a real negative attitude to that sort of thing, but I think that was the point. Part of me thought, let's give it a go and see how this goes.
Yeah.
And I think from that point, as I'm sure you appreciate, the influence of having somebody who can just coach and point you in the right direction with some of these things is absolutely crucial. I'm quite heavily dyslexic. I don't really read books. I'm not a big reader. I'm not a big writer. People see that by the state of some of the emails that go out and things. Anything important has to be proofread, read and corrected. My wife sometimes, when she's looking at things, going, "You're going to have to sit and look at me with this, because I can't make head nor tail of what you're trying to say." But that was when I got introduced to audiobooks. And that was a massively fundamental change for me. Even to the extent now, my daughter, who is doing her hairdressing apprenticeship at the age of 17, she's biking to work every day, and I've started to get her into the gist of listening to audiobooks and podcasts, because I think it's so fundamentally different. Because a lot of this stuff that you need for business and even just for life skills, these kids don't get taught in school.
Yeah.
So the change that had on me was massive, even to the point where one of the classic books, The E-Myth, I mean, I've lost count how many times we've listened to it, Gary.
Yeah.
But I have 3 or 4 go-to books that when something happens, I go back to these things, because they're such key learning tools. And you start to learn different things in these books. But what's really interesting is, although they might say to you in various books of the different things you need to do, you still need somebody who can show you how to actually do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Susan's Pie Shop, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
I remember.
Brilliant.
I just let me take a little segue off to one side based on what you just said there about your daughter and the fact that she's there's some life skills that she doesn't get taught in school. What's missing, do you think? What does she not get?
I teach my kids what tax is. I teach them what a mortgage is. I teach them what a credit card is. I teach them what interest is. Interest rate's very topical at the minute.
Yeah.
And I like to think that my children have an idea now of what interest rates are. These things are all fundamental life skills, and they don't get taught it. So
Crazy.
It's absolutely mad. So we're expecting these youngsters to come into the workplace and be fit for work, and they're not. We have we are very keen on apprentices. We have 8 at the moment. We've got a target by 2030 to have trained with a minimum of 10 qualified. That number's there to be broken. That's not, we just want to prove, that's not there to just get 10 over the line. That's there to get at least 10 over the line.
Yeah.
So apprentices are very keen, but what we're finding is maturity wise, what a 16-year-old was pre-COVID is now an 18-year-old. They've lost a massive area of maturity. They struggle a lot of youngsters struggle to communicate.
Yeah.
They just don't seem to have the maturity in life.
Isn't that interesting? Because that's, normally they would pick that up from their families and their friends and their school environment. Something's gone wrong there.
Absolutely. So we're now having to find that if I was to go back 2 years ago when we were to have a 16-year-old apprentice in the business and their parent was to contact me, I wouldn't really entertain that, because my attitude would be very much a case of they're in the workplace now, they're here in an adult environment to work. I have a very different view on that, partly because I've seen my daughter go through the process, and although I don't get involved in what my daughter does with her employment, that's up to between her and her employer. My daughter will come home and she might ask questions and we might advise her.
Yeah.
It made me realise that actually these apprentices do the same with their parents.
Yeah.
And is it such a bad thing while they're so young, to actually involve the parent sometimes? And maybe if there is a concern with the child, whether it be that they're not performing at college, to actually make the parent aware of that so that they can support the child, because they are still children. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned as well.
Yeah, well, that is fascinating. And of course, the parents themselves have got to have some skills in order to advise their children how to behave in that adult environment.
Absolutely.
Which is interesting.
Absolutely.
So, that was a little segue there. But just coming back to the company then, it's starting to grow now. You're 12 months in. You're thinking about, the business plan. Maybe there's a longer term kind of end in mind type strategy. When did you start to build the team?
I remember taking on our first employee. It was a year in, and it was a young lad apprentice. And he came to us. He was a year into his apprenticeship. He'd relocated with his parents because his parents were in the RF. I remember sitting there doing the calculations, Gary, and just trying to work out if I could afford to take this young lad on.
Yeah. Because
it was one thing having subcontractors working for you who, if the work disappeared, you could just let go.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother thing committing to an apprentice. I remember sitting there tapping the numbers in. I said, okay, I think we can do this. We'll do this. So we offered him a job we took on. 2 months later, I got a phone call from an apprentice who had worked for me at a previous employment, going, I'm just not enjoying it here. Have you got any work? And I'm thinking, this lad's a brilliant lad. It'd be such a shame to miss out on him.
Mm-hmm.
Get the calculator out again. Let's do the numbers. Let's get the spreadsheet up. I think we'll be okay. We can do this.
Yeah.
So we took him on. We ran with it for a few months. And then it come to the point where, as more and more work's starting to come through the door, more and more interest is appearing from customers and people we're talking to. The work we're doing on social media and the reaching out we're starting to do. There's a bit of a momentum starting to build now. We need to employ some more people. I remember winning our first 6-figure project. We were about 18 months in, I think, then. I remember the excitement, but also the dread and the scare of how on earth are we going to deliver this? How are we going to cash flow it? How are we going to resource it?
Yeah.
Where's the team going to come from?
Yeah.
And we were very lucky that about that sort of time, we'd started to attract people to us who we knew. So we knew they were good, reliable engineers, and we'd started to attract them in. A lot of them were coming as subcontractors, because that's the way the industry was and is still very much. And then we started then to employ people directly. I remember taking our first administrator on, who's now our office manager, who's still with us. I remember taking our first electrician on,
Mm-hmm.
and it's starting to build. The momentum's starting to build. We're getting busier and busier. And that fear of, is this going to run away with us? How do we keep this in check? How do we keep this under control? Because we were growing fast.
Yes.
And then it's the idea of, we've now got to build a culture. We've now got to create something. One of the big things when I set EML up, I remember talking with Esther about it when we were doing it, and it's about creating a business where people enjoy coming to work. I'm not saying you have to come and skip through the door, but you have to be happy in your job.
Yeah.
If you're not happy in your job, you're not happy at home. And I'd worked in 2 or 3 companies with toxic environments, especially the one before EML.
Yeah.
And for me, that was what I wanted to absolutely avoid. So we took all the good things that we'd learned from the businesses that we'd worked in, left all the bad things, and made a point of making sure they were left at the door. And that's then what we tried to create. So as we started to employ people, it was then a case of starting to build this culture. And then COVID hit.
Let's just before we talk about the COVID thing, culture is, best designed. I think you as you say, you pick the best things out of your own life experience and decide that is going to be the culture, rather than letting it just kind of bubble up. What was it like when you hired that administrator and you were thinking, this is not an income generating post, this is a cost to the business, but it's essential that we have this person here? How did you make that decision?
That decision was partly made out of trying to relieve some of the work from me. Okay. I think it's when you are trying to do everything, things start to go wrong. And you have to know when the time is that you have to let go.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly good at letting go. I'm probably a lot better at it now than I used to be.
Yeah.
But I certainly remember that stage when she was turning up on the first day, and I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to get her to do?
Yeah. What am I going to trust her with?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. That is interesting, because it is a big step to take on someone who's not generating revenue.
Massive.
The other thing that you said that just caught my attention was that, you've got to be careful that the business doesn't run away with you, because I know that certainly that a lot of people that I've coached, their tendency at the beginning, as I think was mine in my own coaching business, was to say yes to everything at the beginning. Was there a moment when you grew the confidence and were able to say no, or not yet, or?
I think that's probably only come in the last 12 months, Gary. There's been some we've grown very fast. This year alone, we've grown by 117%.
Yeah.
And that's quite typical of our expansion, if not more. And we've now got to slow that down. There's been some real tough events along the way. And there's been times when we've kind of had to sit there and go, do you know what? We're gonna stop working for this client because this client doesn't suit our business anymore.
Yeah.
And they've been really difficult decisions. Yeah. Even in the last 6 months, we terminated a framework agreement with one of our key customers at the time because it was the right thing to do for our business.
Yeah.
That's hard.
They're tough decisions.
Massively tough decisions, because there is that huge risk element of what if is there. And I think in those early days, like you say, you're very keen to let's get the work through. We want the work through. We want to try and make money out of this. We want this to work. We want to grow. We want to push. And sometimes the no word doesn't quite come out.
Yeah. I get that. And I get that it becomes an acquired skill to be able to look at the situation, look at the offer, and look at the person, look at the company, and make a decision. Yeah, that's good. It's good advice actually for businesses who are in that position, thinking about, can I say no to certain things, or change the way I take money on business on. I
think within year 2, if I recall correctly, we walked away from a customer who was quite influential for us at the time, and we walked away from a lot of money they owed us at the time as well. Stupid as that sounds, it was the best decision made. It was the best decision from a business point of view I ever made.
Because some customers can sap your time, sap your energy, not pay you, not communicate very well. Yeah,
I think a good business, Gary, is somebody who can go through their customer list every year and look who they're going to stop trade away from.
Yeah.
Who doesn't fit the mold of the business anymore.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice too. You mentioned the pandemic. we'll have a quick look at that, and then I want to think about how your leadership style changed, and how sometimes you can, in businesses that are growing like yours has, you can refocus yourself on building great processes and systems. But let's just talk about the pandemic. What was the impact on EML at that point?
I remember going home to Esther one day. I remember saying to her, I don't know how we are going to get through this. It was scary, and I think it was for a lot of companies. We were a very young business at the time. We didn't have a huge cash reserve. We'd started to employ people. We now had overheads. It was scary. You suddenly sit there and realise, what happens if? And then your mind starts to wonder, what happens if this fails? What happens if this all goes wrong? What's the consequence?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably quite typical, and most business owners at some point go through that vulnerable stage, don't they, where they really do have those scary thoughts.
Absolutely.
We were very fortunate. We had we put our direct engineers onto the furlough scheme straight away, and we kept our subcontractors going so that everybody could still earn money and still pay their mortgage. So we were very fortunate that our industry didn't stop and it carried on. Within, I think it was 3 weeks was the minimum they had to be on the furlough from memory. We had everybody back at work.
Right.
We were very, very, very fortunate. In fact, the second phase of COVID probably hit us harder than the first phase, because we had a lot more increased costs to sustain and to absorb, but we still had to deliver the same level of service and skill.
So, with the business still running in the pandemic, given what you've said, you come out of the other side of that. You've talked about this quite high growth rate. Was that when that started, when you'd really got to grips with, right, this is the growth target, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to move the business forward?
As we came out of COVID, we really then started to ramp up. Or when we came out of the first phase of COVID, we really started to ramp up. The new year before COVID had hit, I'd actually sat down, I'd gone on New Year's Day the office, and I tend to do it most years now, actually, and I use that time to really just sit down and just review costs. There's no emails going, there's no phones going, and you can sit there and do a bit of planning. So we were we kind of had a bit of idea of where we wanted to go growth wise. I still didn't really at that stage have much of a clue how to do it, if I'm honest.
Right.
A lot of the growth as we came out of COVID came by fluke.
The marketplace was growing. It was
right place, right time, right people.
Yeah.
Just being able, picking up the phone at the right time. And I think that was that. I can't. If somebody was to say to me, "How did you grow the business from the time?" Then we'd have had no more than 5 employees up to what we know. We must have nearly 40 people employed directly or indirectly. I couldn't tell you.
Fascinating, because market forces are out there and they exert pressure or otherwise opportunity on businesses.
Yeah.
Just thinking about yourself then, because one of the great things that I see in my business is the way business owners develop themselves. And you've already talked about your love of audiobooks and your passion for self-development. Thinking about your leadership style and the way that you lead this group of nearly 40 people now, what's changed in you over this time, and what kind of leader are you?
That's a really good question. I think if I was to, how have I changed? I think if I was to go back to how I've changed, I've certainly lost the arrogance and the hierarchy side of it as with having my own business. I think I've learned it's okay to be a bit vulnerable. It's okay to not have the answers.
Yeah.
I think I understand what the difference is between a leader and a dictator, if I can use that word.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know people see a lot of that on LinkedIn and various posts and things like that. But I think I've started to learn the difference between standing there with a big stick and saying, "You will do this."
Yes.
To actually having a team of people who I don't need to say, "You will do this," because they will just do it because they know it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Or they'll do it because it needs doing, and I don't have to ask because they're part of something
behind them as well. They
Absolutely.
understand how the business cycle works. Yeah.
In fact, I remember in one of my employments, one of my managers used to talk about making sure you had everybody on the bus with you. Always talk about making sure everybody's on the bus with you, regards to your team.
Yeah.
So I think it's always good to take as in his words, take a look back and make sure everybody's on that bus with you. Because if you don't, and you don't keep your team in place, you don't keep them motivated, you don't look after them, and you don't lead them, they fall away. So I think I've learned the difference between. I've learned what leadership is to a certain extent. Now, am I the perfect leader? Absolutely not. I've got a long way to go. But I think we've developed a team now and a culture within the organisation that care. So to give you an example, I was sitting down having a conversation with one of our members in the office the other day, and their words to me were, "I've never worked in a place like this before. I can't describe how different this is to working in any other business." Wow. And that person's been there 3-4 years. People who sometimes come into our business, they struggle, maybe struggle is the wrong word. They find it very different to what they're used to working in, because we have a very different way of working in how we treat people, how we look after people. And I think probably the big thing is we care. They're not just employees, they're not just numbers, they're people, and they're part of our team.
So as the leader, one of the profoundly important roles of a leader is to show people the future and get them to come along on the bus. To use your analogy, and go with you as you build EML going forward. How do you convey your vision of the future to that group of people? Because that must be part of the motivational force.
With great difficulty. It's not an easy thing to do.
No.
Last year we had what we called an EML day, which actually went down really well, which is where we basically shut the business for the day. And we took everybody off we used a meeting room at one of our suppliers, and we put food on and so on. And we spent the morning where I gave a bit of a talk about the business. We talked about the history, where we'd come from, because a lot of people didn't know.
Yeah.
We spoke about where the business was going and what our plans were for the future. And then the afternoon we talked about what does good look like? So how can we improve the business?
Yeah.
And we got everybody involved in that side of things that we could change and things we could improve. And we'll do that again. We're probably going to look at doing that probably December time, I think, this year, rather than in the summer. How do we get people? Make sure people are on the bus, we involve them. I think that's probably the best way to put it. We talk quite openly with the key members of the team of what the plans are. Do I know exactly what the plans are for the future? No, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Because
they change and they evolve with the business.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. I mean, I think often we look far into the future, and it's very difficult to look. I don't know, probably more than a year actually in any form of detail. You can have an idea of what 3 years and 5 years looks like, but the external environment changes so quickly as well. But the fact that you are actually planning and thinking about conveying that to the people is a powerful motivational force.
I think one thing that I've certainly learned over the last 24 months is the importance of planning and budgeting and having a plan. Yeah.
Good advice for business owners. So just to finish off, Mark, I want to take you back to the beginning, and it's a slightly contrived question, but I like to ask it because I'm thinking about, if you could go back to that point, knowing what you know now, what would you say to the young Mark as he sets out on his EML journey?
Wow. Don't be afraid to get on and do it. There have been some amazing times along the way. There's been some very challenging times the way. The other week we won the Apprentice Award for Peterborough as an employer, which was absolutely, that was cloud nine. That was fantastic. That just showed everything that we are as a business.
Yeah.
But there's also been some very difficult times. But don't be afraid to get on and do it, and don't be afraid to build that team around you that will support you and help you with it, because you might own the business. And me and Esther are jointly own the business, but we're not the ones who have built it. We've got a team around us who have worked with us to build that business, and they're part of it. And I think the importance of, yes, get on and do it, but make sure you've got the right people around with you. Yeah. And if you haven't got the right people around you, change them.
That is brilliant advice. Brilliant advice. We've had a few people on the podcast who've said, knowing what I know now, I would have started earlier. So getting on and doing it strong advice.
Yeah.
Mark, we've cantered through the history of EML, but I appreciate your time and I appreciate you sharing your knowledge and showing people what it's like to grow a business from scratch up to the level that you've got it now. So thanks for spending some time with me on the Business Sense podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.